Next week is the last weekend before we hit the homecoming weekend and we start a brand new series. But all summer long, we've been teaching through a series we've called Summer Stories. And it's been fascinating and fabulous, for me anyhow, as we've looked at different stories in the Bible, and the Bible is jammed full of stories of people who experienced God, people who witnessed the miraculous power of God. It's full of stories of people who were perhaps full of fear or who had challenges just like you and I do, and God moved on their behalf. And we've heard many different stories throughout the summer. And next weekend, we're going to hear from 3 different people, 3 different stories in every service. So we have 3 services. We have 9 different speakers across the weekend next week, which is going to be awesome. We're looking forward to that. It is the long weekend, so if you're away, you're going to want to tune in online and follow along with us. But today, as I have one more opportunity to address a story or somebody in the Bible, I want to teach from the life of Moses. And Moses is a guy with a big story. It would be impossible to tell you the whole thing. You may or may not be familiar with the story, the journey of Moses. But I love Moses because he is somebody who's just like you and I. He is. He's somebody who was full of excuses, who had challenges with the call of God like we so often do. And yet he's somebody who, if you think about him, if I say the name Moses, you probably think of a strong, bold leader. We think of him, parting the Red Sea and leading the people through. Or we think of him encountering God face to face with the 10 Commandments. Moses walked an incredible journey, and his story speaks to us of the power of God because God used him powerfully. And yet Moses is somebody who had challenges and insecurities and dealt with fear in the same way that you and I do. And God is really good, actually, at using those kind of people. We've heard a few of those stories through this summer, but if you think about it, God used people like Gideon. He used Deborah, a woman, which shocked likely everybody. God used Paul, who was a murderer. He consistently chooses people who you or I probably would have walked right past and thought, oh, not that guy. Somebody else can carry out God's plans and God's purposes. But God consistently chooses the person that you or I probably would skip over. If it was up to us, we'd probably just bypass ourselves. God, go ahead and use somebody else. But God chose to use Moses. And he is an amazing example of somebody who was likely, he felt unqualified, he felt unsure, and yet God did amazing things through his life. And so I'm going to look today at the story of the burning bush. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this or not. If you grew up in Sunday school, you definitely are. But when Moses was 80, he encountered God. He encountered the holiness of God. When he was out in a field, he was living a shepherd's life, and he noticed that a bush nearby appeared to be on fire. And as he got closer to it, he realized it wasn't normal fire. It wasn't burning up. In fact, it was God. And he was 80 years old at that time. And we're going to look at how God spoke directly to Moses, gave him a little glimpse, actually, of the holiness of God that was about to be manifest, because God was about to do amazing things using his man Moses. But before that, the journey of this guy's life was kind of up and down, and it looked unusual and scattered, perhaps, just as we walk a journey that sometimes doesn't make sense to us, but that God has planned and that God has purpose for us. Moses was born at a time when there was great turmoil. There was oppression. He was a Hebrew baby boy who was born at a time when Hebrew baby boys were supposed to be killed. And the Bible tells us that when Moses was born, his parents looked at him and they saw something special about him, which I think we all think that when we look at our precious newborn. But when they looked at Moses, they knew, they saw something, that God had a plan for him. And so they risked death by saving his life. Moses' mom put him in a basket, something that would float, and hid him in the reeds at the edge of the river. And she did that so that he would live and not be killed. And Pharaoh's daughter came across this baby, heard him crying, went to investigate. Her heart was moved. She wanted to adopt him. Moses' sister Miriam was nearby, and the Bible tells us that she was protecting her little brother. She was keeping an eye on him, and she asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Would you like me to find a nurse to take care of this newborn?" The princess said yes. So Miriam went and got her mother. And so Moses was with his mom, his birth mom, until he was weaned. And then she handed him off to Pharaoh's daughter. And so he grew up in the palace, in Pharaoh's daughter's house. He grew up in the land of Egyptians, very different than the people that he came from. And so he was a guy, if you think about it, who probably didn't ever really fit in. He was a child of Israel living amongst the Egyptians. And we know that his heart was for his people because the Bible tells us when he was about 40, he went to visit his family. And as he went out, he encountered an Egyptian torturing a Hebrew man, and Moses was moved. And we could assume that God had already put in his heart a desire for justice. We see that acted out throughout his life. But when Moses sees one of his people being tortured by one of his other people, he's moved, and he actually killed the Egyptian, and he ends up going to hide. Word gets out that Moses has killed an Egyptian. Pharaoh gets upset, and Moses takes off. And he makes a new life for himself, away from the life where he had grown up. At 40 years old, he takes off. He finds a family somewhere else. He marries a daughter. He settles. He has children. He is a shepherd. And that life seems to kind of be left behind. And yet, we see how when God meets up with him in this burning bush, how there's a seed inside of him that's activated, and Moses becomes eventually the leader that God's called him to be, but not without challenges and excuses first. So I want to look at Exodus 3. We'll start in verse 1, and here we have this story where God shows up to speak with Moses. It says, "One day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock far into the wilderness, and he came to Sinai, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush. Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up. 'This is amazing,' Moses said to himself. 'Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go see it.' When the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush, 'Moses, Moses.' 'Here I am,' Moses replied. 'Do not come any closer,' the Lord warned. 'Take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob.' When Moses heard this, he covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord told him, 'I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries of distress because of their harsh slave drivers. Yes, I am aware of their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and lead them out of Egypt into their own fertile and spacious land. It is a land flowing with milk and honey, the land where the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites now live. Look, the cry of the people of Israel has reached me, and I have seen how harshly the Egyptians abused them. Now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people, Israel, out of Egypt.' But Moses protested to God. 'Who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt?' God answered, and he says, 'I will be with you. And this is your sign that I am the one who has sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God at this very mountain.'" So this story perhaps sounds familiar if you've heard it before or a few times before. But imagine that you're out in the middle of nowhere. It says he's in the wilderness, just surrounded by sheep. There's a bush that suddenly leaps into flames, and then you hear the voice of God calling your name from the fire. And as he approaches it, God says, stop, don't get any closer, and take off your feet. It's holy. It would have been an awesome sight. And Moses has been hiding. He's been perhaps content with this new life he's built, that he's living. And yet God finds him and encounters him and calls him out and tells him that yes, he has heard the cry of his people. And know this, it's been a long, super long season of the people of God crying out with no apparent response. They've been suffering for a long time. They've been tortured. They've been slaves. And they've been calling out. And it would seem that God doesn't hear and God hasn't responded. And yet he speaks to Moses and he says, I've heard the cry of my people. And he calls them his people. And I'm sure that when Moses heard God's voice and then heard this amazing news that God had heard the cry and he is about to free his people, that Moses' heart leapt. That there would have been excitement there, great excitement. Yes, finally, yes, God, this is what we've been praying for. But then God says, and hey, you're going to be the one to lead my people out. And at that point, Moses' insecurity kicks in because the first question he asks God is, God, who am I? Who am I? His insecurities right away rise to the surface. And I know this is familiar to all of us, that when you are in an uncomfortable situation, perhaps you're feeling it today, where you're not sure how to move past the mountain that's in your way, or there's people in your life that you know God has connected you with because he has a plan for them and they don't yet know it, but it's uncomfortable for you. When God calls you, the first thing we tend to do is ask, who am I? Who am I to be the answer? Who am I to say the words that you'd have me say? Who am I? Because we all have an enemy, and what he goes after is our identity. So we question whether or not we're qualified or capable to do the thing that God has called us to do. We all do. Our enemy reminds us of our past that wasn't really that long ago. And as we're trying perhaps to reach out to somebody who's walking a path that we've seen victory in, our enemy will remind us, well, you're not that different. That's who you were. He'll put things in front of us. He'll remind us that we have failed in the past. He'll use whatever he needs to stop you from doing what God calls you to do. You know what it is often for me? I'll question whether or not I should be doing something because it's almost too obvious. This is silly. I'm just going to be vulnerable for a moment. So my insecurity would be, why would you do that? You're, pastor's kid. Let somebody else do it. People are going to think you're just doing it because you have to. Of course you're saying that. Of course you're doing that. You have to. And we all have to identify and move past our insecurities and recognize that that is not the voice of God. The voice of God is one that's always going to call you and compel you forward. And the enemy will tell you, just stop, just be small. Just stay right where you are. Who are you? And that's what Moses said. Who am I? And so God answers him, and he tells him that he's going to go with him. And that would be God's response to you as well, that he's not going to call you somewhere, ask you to do something that he's just going to send you off to figure out on your own. He goes with you. And if God is with you, who can be against you? Amen? God says, I will be with you. But Moses isn't done. He has a few more questions for God. And so in verse 13, he's protesting again. And Moses says, if I go to the people of Israel and tell them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they will ask me, what is his name? Then what should I tell them? God replied to Moses, I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my eternal name, my name to remember for all generations. Here Moses has another question for God, and he asks, but what will I say? But God, if I go and I do this thing, what will I say? And I'm sure you can relate with that as well, because sometimes God puts somebody else in our path that we think we're supposed to perhaps speak with or encourage or pray for. And we think, yeah, okay, I could do that, but what exactly am I going to say? What if they ask me a question that I don't have the answer for because I haven't gone to Bible school perhaps, or I haven't got that theology degree? What if they ask me something that I'm not sure how to answer? And we put questions out there that stop us before we even begin. And Moses did the same thing. Now, Moses is asking God, but if they ask me who you are and who sent me, what am I supposed to say? Because he's a man who grew up in an Egyptian house. He didn't get to study the way that his Hebrew, that his Israelite brothers, sisters, others would have. And he has insecurities because of it. And those rise to the surface. He feels like he's unqualified, like he can't answer the questions that are going to come up. And yet God has uniquely positioned him for influence. When God says, tell them, I am has sent you. Yahweh has sent you. What he's saying is, tell them that I am the God, the one who existed before time, the beginning and the end. I am the God who is to come. I am the God, which is an answer that would resonate with an Egyptian, with Pharaoh, because the Egyptians worshipped many different gods. They had all kinds of gods. And God is saying, I am God, the God. Tell them, God, I am, Yahweh sent you. He gives Moses the words to speak. So God's leading him, and he's equipping him and answering his questions as God so patiently does with all of us. So God tells Moses to go and gather up all the elders and to tell them that God's been speaking to him and that they're supposed to go and address Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh they need to go out into the wilderness to worship God. And God tells Moses, you're going to do this, and I'm going to go with you. And it's going to be challenging. They're going to have a problem with you and your people leaving to go out into the wilderness. But it's okay, God says, because I am going to perform miraculous things. And in the end, he sets them up. He says, in the end, as you leave, they're going to send you on your way. And in fact, they're going to give you gifts, and you're going to get out of here. I already have a plan. God kind of lays out what's going to happen for Moses. And Moses responds. Exodus 4, verse 1. He protests again and he says, what if they won't believe me or listen to me? What if they say, the Lord never appeared to you? So God has just told them, you're going to go and they're going to believe you. And here's what's going to happen. It's going to be cool. I have it all worked out. And Moses replies by saying, okay, but what if they don't believe me? And here we see that he gives voice to fear. Fear that's motivating him and stopping him. What if they don't believe me? Again, Moses is putting answers or responses in their mouths before they even have a chance to answer. He's already decided what the outlook could look like. And we have no idea how people are going to respond when we tell them what God is saying to us or what God is leading us to do. We don't know. But fear would cause us to project and to decide ahead of time what might happen and let that hold us back. He gives voice to his fear. And fear of man is the enemy of God. Fear of man holds us back and it stops the work of God. And yet God is the one who gives us a voice to speak, who gives us a path to walk. God's already created a plan. He already knows the end from the beginning, but fear would cause us to hold back. And so that's what Moses says. But what if they don't listen to me? And so God again helps him out. He says, okay, he gives him like a bag of tricks, if you will. He tells him, what's in your hand, Moses? Moses has a staff in his hand. He says, throw it down on the ground. And so Moses does, and the staff turns into a snake. He says, pick it up again, and he picks up the snake, which was brave right there. baby steps, Moses. Picks up the snake and it turns back into a staff again. God says, watch this. Take your hand and put it into your jacket. And so Moses does. He sticks it into his cloak and he pulls it out again, and his hand is diseased. It's leprous. And God says, stick it back in. He sticks it back in, pulls it out, and it's healthy and whole again. God says, if you take water from the river and you put it on the ground, it will turn to blood. Watch this. And he does. And that's exactly what happens. And so God says, if they question you, if you are met with questions, this is what you can do. He equips him. He shows him his power, and it's right there in Moses' hand. And he equips him for what he's about to encounter, which is cool, but not quite good enough for Moses, because he goes on and he pleads with the Lord. Exodus 4:10. Here Moses says, but God, I am not very good with words. I never have been, I'm not now. Even though you have spoken to me, I get tongue-tied and my words get tangled. Then the Lord asked Moses, who makes a person's mouth? Who decides whether people speak or do not speak, hear or do not hear, see or do not see? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will be with you as you speak, and I will instruct you in what to say. Here we see Moses say, hey God, but I've never done this. I've never done this well. I can't speak. I'm not ready for this. He feels unprepared, as we all so often do. And his excuse to God is that he's not ready. He hasn't done this before. And we know that the best way to prepare is just to do the thing, right? We heard from Pastor Helen last week, who was talking about prayer, and she said the best way to learn how to pray is to pray. The best way to learn how to speak is to just go ahead and speak. The best way to pray with somebody, to pray for somebody, is to go ahead and do it. And yet, so often you do it trembling at first and stuttering, as Moses said he did. And yet when we open our mouth or we stretch out our hand or we walk where he's asked us to, as we do, he says, I will be with you and I will show you the way. I love that God says, who gives a man a mouth to speak with? Who put those words in your mouth? It's not you, Moses, it's me. And if we let feeling unprepared stop us from what God is asking us to do, we're going to stay small and disconnected and self-centered and inward-focused, which is a sad, sad, sad picture. But God calls us to do what he's called us to do with boldness and to follow him. Moses says, I haven't ever. That's his almost last excuse, but he's got one more. He finally says, Exodus 4:13, he pleads with God, and here he says, Lord, please send anyone else. God's kind of broken down all of his excuses, and he's answered his questions, and he's told him that he's going to go with him, and he's going to give him the words, and God already has it planned out. And yet Moses responds by saying, okay, cool, thanks, God, but please, could you send somebody else? Somebody else must be better prepared, better equipped, have more experience. Somebody else could do this better. Please send anybody else. And it's interesting because God, who's so patiently responded to Moses through this whole conversation, at this point, Scripture tells us that God gets angry. He's kind of done now. Okay, enough. And he tells Moses that he can go and find his brother Aaron. In fact, Aaron's already on his way, so God already knew what was going to happen. He had anticipated all of this. But he says, go with Aaron. Aaron is a good communicator. He knows how to speak. And so you can talk to Aaron and you can instruct him, but he'll be the one who speaks. Go together. Which again is so like God, because you'd think at this point in this back and forth exchange that Moses had given every excuse and God could have just disqualified him. Fine, don't do what I've asked you to do. I'm just going to use Aaron. He can speak. Sounds like Aaron's a guy who likes the microphone. He's going to be fine with telling the people what to do. But he doesn't. God's chosen Moses. Moses is his guy for this assignment. But he brings Aaron to go with him. And when they finally make the decision that they're going to do what God has asked them to do, and it must have taken great boldness. It wasn't like it was a small thing God asked them to do. God sent them to go back into Egypt and speak to Pharaoh. Pharaoh, the boss, the guy who had the power to strike them dead, to go and ask him to let God's people go. It was huge. But when Moses decided he was going to do it, he does it with boldness. And again, so often when we hear a Bible story, it's kind of condensed and short, and it is today because we only have 30 minutes together. But what God asked them to do is go and confront Pharaoh, and then God unleashed the plagues. First of all, he turned water to blood, and I was reading through this, and it's mind-blowing that all the water, the rivers, in fact, even the water in people's pots and pans at home turned into blood. Imagine that. And then there was frogs. Frogs overcame the land. And that's one thing to just imagine, the land crawling with frogs. But even after that plague had ended and the frogs were dead, they had dead frogs. And the Bible talks about that. Dead, decaying frogs everywhere. Gross. And Moses was responsible for telling Pharaoh this was going to happen and then for it happening. And there were fleas that overtook the land. We were talking about it last night. My husband Rod said, we freak out when there's a bunch of fruit flies in the sink. Imagine swarming bugs around us. And it just escalated and escalated. There was darkness that overcame the land. We've survived the eclipse. But imagine darkness for hours, days. Somebody said this week that they felt sorry for the person who believed in the rapture but somehow hadn't heard about the eclipse coming. That would be scary. And then finally, the firstborn son in every family died. Overwhelming loss. What God asked Moses to do was huge. Huge. And then he leads the people through the Red Sea. Ridiculous. Can't quite imagine. It was huge. But God had already chosen him, appointed him. God chose somebody who we wouldn't have chosen and somebody who didn't ask for it, because God knew that Moses would be completely dependent on him, that his confidence was not in himself. There wasn't any of that. He needed God. And so God's power showed up, and it was obvious through the life of Moses. And here's the thing, each one of us, you and I, God has a plan for your life. Sometimes we just kind of excuse ourselves that the people in the Bible have big stories, and perhaps you know of a few people recently who have lived big lives or made a big impact, but we don't think of ourselves necessarily as being called by God and purposed by God. But the Bible tells us that there is a plan and a purpose for each one of us. For you, there is. And when it feels overwhelming, that's okay. You're in a great position to trust God, to not let the insecurities that rise up, the fear that rises up, that feeling of being unqualified or unprepared for whatever God is calling you to do, to not let those things hold you back from taking the next step. I don't know what your journey looks like, and I don't know what God's calling you to do today, but I bet you have an idea of what it is, because he's faithful to lead you and to speak to you. If you're listening, you probably have an idea. If you don't, go ahead and ask him. But I pray that whatever he's calling you to do, you won't shrink back from. That if he asks you to do something that feels a little bit uncomfortable, but he says, trust me, I will go with you, that you'll trust him and follow him. When we look at Hebrews 11, we've been, in Exodus, which is the beginning of the Bible, the second chapter of the Bible. But if we go to the New Testament, and we read about the great heroes of our faith. We read about Moses. His parents were in here as well, by the way. His parents who saw something in their son and chose to risk death to save his life. But Moses as well rose up in faith. And though he lived an imperfect life and his walk wasn't straight, God used him in a powerful way. Hebrews 11:24 says, "By faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible." By faith, Moses chose to follow God over being comfortable. When God called him, though he had lots of excuses and challenges, he decided he was in, and God used him mightily. And Moses lived in a time that was chaotic, and there was bondage. His people were in bondage. And I hope that you see the parallels of the time and the age that we're living in. There's chaos and darkness, and people are lost and literally dying to have the hope that we have because of Jesus. God had to use a burning bush to get to Moses, but the Spirit of God is here with us right here, right now. He's in you. And he does speak to us, and he does compel us, and he asks us to follow him. It may be uncomfortable, but he promises that he will never leave you and he will never forsake you. I'd love it if you would bow your heads for a moment and close your eyes so that I can pray for you. My prayer is that we would be a church who would not only listen to God, but who would also follow him boldly, that our excuses and fear wouldn't hold us back. He's a good God, and he loves you, and he has a plan for your life.